Every year, the National Urban League releases its highly anticipated report on the state of Black America. The report has become the national touchstone for the social and economic status of African American and Hispanic communities. Each year, we ask the question, what is the state of Black America? Today, our esteemed panelists will answer that question as it relates to Black women and discuss solutions and best practices for overcoming the challenges facing women of color. What is the state of Black women? How do we improve it? Joining me to discuss this, Melanie Campbell, CEO of the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation and the convener of the Black Women's Roundtable. Chanel Hardy, Senior Vice President for Policy and Executive Director of the National Urban League Policy Institute. And Tanisha A. Sykes, Senior Editor of Personal Finance and Careers with Essence Magazine. Welcome, you all.
Thank you.
50 years since the March on Washington, and we are still discussing why women don't make as much when they have the education. We just saw the COO, Sheryl Sandberg of Facebook, talking about how women in particular are affected by the lack of earning when they have the qualified education. How is this affecting Black women in particular?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a variety of ways to answer that, Jeff. One thing is that the majority of African American households are women-headed. So the state of Black America is the state of Black women. We have challenges as African Americans and as women in terms of pay equity. And we know that some of these situations could be addressed by policy. As we discussed earlier, education and other reasonable factors do not explain the gap. So we have to have real talk about persistence of discrimination in terms of race and gender. But as Sheryl Sandberg, to your point, has raised, there are additional issues that impact women's earning capacity. And that includes our family responsibilities for those of us who are raising children and aren't raising children. Women disproportionately support other family members. So there are a lot of ways in which we're challenged in terms of pay equity, but if we address that issue and focus on that issue, it will pay tremendous dividends in terms of our economic advancement.
Sure, and Melanie, Chanel has talked about some of the areas, policy being one of them. What really is the policy agenda that begins to address pay equity, and is there even room in this kind of congressional climate for the kind of policy that specifically speaks to Black women who are overwhelmingly affected?
Well, it's the policy and the politics, right? And so they're hand in hand. So right now, we have had a couple of years of a very hostile political environment, especially on the federal level, congressional level, and in many cases actually on a state level. So part of what we know, all of us in this room, and the group that I work with on Black Women's Roundtable, we know that we have to leverage our power and be more strategic about that power, be more bold about our power. And so part of what the state organizing that we have to do is we have to push back. A lot has happened since the 2010 midterm election cycle that we're living with now, with who was elected to Congress, who was elected to these state houses, who's in the legislature, and the boldness of some of this attack on women is not devoid of the attack on Black women. As my sister Chanel talked about, is that we are heads of household. Whether we are mothers, we're still mothers. You know, I didn't birth children, but I have a whole lot of nieces, nephews, great nieces, nephews, and we are a village in our families, and so we have all of those responsibilities. But the policy can't change without the politics and leveraging that vote, which we have. But we've not fully maximized
but with
the power
that,
of that
and that really speaks to movement work in a lot of ways. And clearly there are nuances to all this. But Tanisha, when we're talking about white women's movements, we regularly are able to point to faces. These are the leaders of suffrage movements. These are the women of these are the people fighting for white women's power. Who are the faces in the Black community? Do we have them? Are there organizations that are functioning? And what do we need to do to play this politics game a little differently than we have?
You know, I think the thing that we need to do is really assert our power, just like you said, in terms of, I think we do have the National Urban League. I think we do have the NAACP. I do think we have companies like mine, Essence, that are really talking about Black women, this is what you need to do now. We need to be a lot more strategic in terms of where we are in the workplace. place. You know, I do agree with Sheryl Sandberg in terms of, you know, women need to do more. But what we say at Essence is you need to learn to own your power. And just like our white female counterparts are coming together and making sure that they have the mentors and the sponsors in their pockets, we need to do the same thing. And I think we're not doing enough of that.
Well, and Cheryl, Chanel, rather, excuse me, you said that we can't confuse ability with opportunity.
Right.
And that really isn't a conversation that I hear us having regularly. We tell our girls to go do it. They're going to school, they're graduating, they're getting advanced degrees, they're getting PhDs, they're doing all of the things that we said you had to do to be successful.
Right.
And then the pay, and in some cases the position, doesn't follow.
Right.
Is there a narrative shift that we need to have with our girls in our community about that difference between ability and opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've seen significant progress in the Black community over the past 50 years. It's really a great tale of how hard we've worked since emancipation and since the March on Washington to take advantage of the opportunities that the new laws gave us. But we still, as you said, have not been able to break that last barrier in terms of race and that race-gender intersection. And so in many ways, it's a new old conversation. We used to tell our children, you have to be better than in order to get those opportunities. That's still just as true. The 2-to-1 unemployment rate, unemployment disparity between African Americans and whites, it persists. And so we know that we still have to combat racism and sexism in our employment search. But in addition, we need to, as both of my sisters have said, make sure that we exercise our power so that policies that could support our ability to achieve are enacted. Pay equity, if we could get the Paycheck Fairness Act passed, if we could get, and this gets back to your question about the environment. Right now we're having a conversation about spending versus deficit reduction. And one is going to slow the economy and one is going to grow the economy. If we made investments, which we see in many other countries around the world, in daycare, in Head Start, in better family leave practices, and policies, that would make a big difference in what women are able to do so that we can push. Those of us that aren't Sheryl Sandbergs and don't have an army of support to make it easier for us to raise our children and spend time with our partner, we need a little bit of assistance from society as a whole.
Well, we're all, and that's really corporate will in a lot of ways, but we're also talking about pipeline.
Right.
I mean, I'm an 80s kid, right? And so I remember my father being a part of that middle management system of corporate America that really was a springboard for a lot of black men to be able to become VPs and ultimately CEOs. Where is that pipeline for black women? Do we see it existing in certain industries and not others? Where can it be replicated, and how can we push our corporate friends in a way that may be more effective than some of our political friends?
One of the concerns that we're going to have to address that gets back to the politics is that we became middle class through public sector jobs, not so much private sector jobs. And the erosion of workers' rights to organize in these states is having an extreme devastating effect in places like Wisconsin and now Michigan, possibly Ohio. And then where we live, 55% of us in the South, what workers' rights, what is that? The South, where 55% of black people live, the labor movement is crippled. So the other part of addressing and really, and I know you know this and everyone on the table, all politics is local, but it's also connected to the national. We really have to get together on our political strategy to push back on this, because nothing we can do is going to change what happened 2 years ago. But there's always another election. And so I'm really laser focused on that, because you're seeing thousands of jobs in one fell swoop being lost from going from middle class. You go to Michigan, where they're going to try to take over the city of Detroit. What is that going to look? Right. They have taken over. You know, they're pushing back, but the reality of what that means for the immediacy of loss of jobs is not something that just comes because the economy may not be well, but just political decisions.
But let's deal with that a little bit, because clearly what that now means is black women are on the lowest level of the totem pole in certain levels. So who are the political allies? And so if you start talking about, there was a time when we clearly understood that white women's issues were white women's issues, and they didn't necessarily transfer to black women. Is that still as true as it was 50 years ago? And if it's not, where are the real alliances politically that can take place where black women aren't doing all of the heavy lifting?
Can I just say one point, because I think it goes back to your question, Jeff, about corporate will. And I think to some extent, corporations are really starting to recognize the power of diversity and how it improves your profits. And so black women in many ways are a double threat. We bring gender diversity and we bring the perspective that we have as a racial minority. So I think that we've seen, and the data bears it out, that there's been improvements in terms of hiring and that unemployment gap in corporate America. So I think we need to get the corporate folks who are starting to recognize this to be our allies, because this should not be a conversation about handouts for a particular group of people. It should be a conversation about, if we want to move our nation forward, if we want to maximize profits, if we want to maximize growth, we need to use our national assets and resources. And black women are a national asset and resource.
Well, Tanisha, and you can dovetail, but let me ask you this, because obviously we need multiple strategies, and we talked about the political, we talked about the corporate, but clearly there's an entrepreneurial strategy here, because we know that we've got the ability to control wages and sometimes profit when we control the business.
Absolutely, yeah.
How are we seeing that change? Because we know there are more and more women entrepreneurs and business owners.
Exactly. What you're looking at when you look at the statistics is there are more African American entrepreneurs entering this space than in any other class or race of people. And that's a good thing, because what we've been telling our reader is, and I've been telling the reader this since the beginning, you always have to be owning something. So whether you have the job, you need to also be doing the hair, you need to be having the daycare, you need to be making sure that you can do the accounting, because you want to do that, because what it does is small businesses are what America is built upon. And so it really goes back to that. And when we talk about this diversity piece, there's nothing new under that sun, except for the fact that now corporations are starting to realize this is something that could be a moneymaker for us, in terms of us being able to leverage the fact that we have all of this talent that we're actually acknowledging now. And that's where, go ahead.
No, but are we identifying sectors? And so, for instance, we know that there have been certain periods of time where sectors changed the economic reality for certain demographics. When we look at technology, whether it's everything from learning code to being engineers, or we look at the green space, is there a space on the horizon that black women can say, wait a minute, we're going to own this, and here's some ways we can do that?
I think when you have people like Ursula Burns working with the president and really talking about what STEM means to us and how we need to get into science and we need to get into technology and engineering, that's key and that's important, because that's a space that we haven't as a people, you know, whether we're talking about our little girls or even our little boys, we really haven't taken advantage of that. And so it really starts at the lower education level, and then you need to get up to the point where they're able to take advantage not only of those sectors and those jobs, but understanding that that is where the future is.
But Chanel,
and so you want to be a part of that.
With that, I hear you say regularly how we talk about what we need to do a lot of times, but haven't always talked about what we've done. We're not new to STEM as a community, but we haven't necessarily told our story effectively. So who becomes responsible, whether it's Essence Magazine or whether it's some of our older institutions, of really talking about, wait a minute, Mae Jemison was STEM. Here are the sisters, and I know you weren't negating that, but we got young people in school thinking black people aren't STEM. So how do we tell that story? Because that really is a narrative that's going to affect young women's trajectory into some of these spaces.
Well, that's where we have to rely upon the next generation, and I think it's interesting because I think that I'm kind of in between. So there's a generation of the freedom fighters that came before me, and the millennials are after me. And so there's certainly, if you talk about middle management, I'm that middle management for today's civil rights struggle. But I have to rely on the generation after me to tell me, how do I get you to pay attention to what already exists? State of Black America has been published for 37 years. I spoke to a group of high school students on Monday, and I asked, who has read Roots? Who has read Up From Slavery, The Souls of Black Folk, the Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, Autobiography of Malcolm X, these critical historical pieces. I mean, I didn't even get into the biographies of Dorothy Height and Mary McLeod Bethune, Sojourner Truth, but these are just some basic parts of our canon as a people. That story has been told, but our young people aren't reading it and aren't being taught it in schools. There were seniors in that group. So what do we do to use, as we talked about you, Jeff's Nation, 41,000 followers on Twitter, how do we use the platforms that we know our young people are using? Black people are using Twitter more than anybody else. Yeah. We're on Facebook. We are networking online. How do we use those structures to tell the story that's already been told? Because that work has been done. We need to translate it for today's listeners.
So keeping with the Redeem the Dream theme, so much of what we're fighting for is equity.
Right.
50 years from now, are we closer to equity? In 10 seconds, yes or no?
I would say, yes, we are.
Okay.
And that's all you want me to say?
Yes.
Okay.
Slightly. We've made great progress as a people, but that gap is persistent.
The gap is persistent, but we're doing better than we were doing, but we need to do more.
Absolutely, and we could have a lot longer conversation. Thank you to my panelists for participating in this dynamic conversation. Please share this web series with your social media friends and followers, even if you have more or less than 41,000. And let's continue the solution session using hashtag SOBA13. Now you've got to get involved. The State of Black America web series is presented by AT&T. We'd like to thank AT&T for their continued support of the National Urban League. We also thank Comcast for their production support of the State of Black America web series. Together, we are empowering communities and changing lives. You can join me every Sunday from 5 to 7 p.m. on my digital show, The Intersection, at www.bliss.fm, or follow me on Twitter at Jeff's Nation. For more information on the State of Black America and to purchase the book, visit National Urban League at nul.org.
Hello, National Urban League. My name is Cynthia Marshall, Senior Vice President for Human Resources for AT&T. On behalf of our more than 240,000 employees, we're excited to support, for the third year, the National Urban League's State of Black America report and discussion. Our commitment to diversity is vital to the success of our company. For AT&T, an innovative, diverse, and competitive workforce ultimately begins with providing better educational opportunities for everyone. And that is why we remain supportive of the State of Black America's report. I am reminded of Maya Angelou's beautiful statement about all threads in the tapestry being equal in value, no matter what their color. Or the poignant words of Mikhail Gorbachev, that peace is not unity in sameness, but unity in diversity. For AT&T, this understanding of diversity's value is one of our bedrock convictions. Our partnership with you underscores our deep commitment to diversity and empowerment. And so today, we salute the National Urban League on another successful, substantive, and thought-provoking report. Job well done, Mark Morial.